Welcome back to task 3, sign in and test users. In this task, I'm going to test the permissions for each IAM user. Now, to do that, I need to get to their sign-in URL for the users, and there's a link for that. So looking at the instructions, it tells me to click on the dashboard. That's the dashboard right here. So that is the dashboard in the navigation pane on the left. And then it indicates that on the right, I should see something that looks like this, but I don't see it on the right. Now, that means that there wasn't enough room to display it on this page, so I'd have to scroll down to find it, and you can see it right there. However, if I close the navigator, I would see it on the right-hand side. So they're not completely wrong. I've just squeezed so much into my screen here that it couldn't fit it. So I found that sign-in URL looks very similar to what we see here, right? Okay, so that's for the IAM users in this count. Now, what I'm going to do is copy that sign-in URL for those users into a text editor, so I can use the copy button there, and then paste that into a text editor. Then what I need to do is open a private or incognito window. I'm using Firefox, so to do that, I could go over here, and you'll see that there are options across here, and one of them is new private window. When I click that, it's going to open a new window on my desktop that's in incognito mode. Why do I need to do that? Because the only way I'm going to be able to log in under that sign-in URL and not get logged out from this dashboard is if I use that. Otherwise, it's going to, if I create a new sign-in page, it's going to use the current credentials that you can see stored here. These credentials log me in. I don't want to use those, so I need to use this path. So let's try that now. So from here, new private window, and it opens in a page like this, right? And then what I can do is, since I didn't copy it, I'm just going to go over here like this, copy it like so, paste it in. Okay, so you can see the account ID that's been applied at the top, right? That's what I need at the top of this. And then I'm going to use the credentials for that first user. My user 1, safest way to do this is to copy and paste that into the page here, so I don't get an error. I do not want to save these credentials because it's temporary. It's for this lab. So if it asks me to save it, I'm going to tell it not to. I don't want to save any of this information. And I'll go ahead and sign in. And if I look up at the top here, you can see I've signed in as user 1 right there under that account ID. And my interface looks very different. Okay. I want to get this out of my way, so I'm just going to click these to get them done. And I'll make them disappear. Now, in the instructions, it's telling me to go to S3 to open the S3 console. Now, if we think about what user 1 can do, user 1 should have the ability to provide S3 support. So that's what we're going to be testing right now. Best practice when you set up a user account or any resource on AWS is to test to ensure that it actually is functioning as expected and that they have the rights and capabilities. So here we go. I've logged in, so I'm going to go to S3. So I can just type in S3 at the top here. And there I can see something called sample bucket. All right. And what I want to do is select that bucket. Since this user 1 is part of the S3 support group, they have permission to view a list of Amazon S3 buckets and contents, and that's what we saw. Doesn't have any objects. Now I'm going to test whether I have access to EC2, right? So what I'm going to do is click on or navigate over to EC2. I'll go to the dashboard. And notice all the API errors. It's telling me that I'm not allowed to view these. Okay. Now I did notice that I'm not in the US East. I'm in I'm in US East 2. This is left over from some other account. And you'll see I get the same error. So it doesn't matter what region I'm in, because this is not a regional restriction. This is global for all EC2. Essentially, least privilege means that until I'm given permission or the user's given permission, they don't have access. Let's put it back over. We'll put it back on Ohio where we were. Now, so we can see that that user can't get access, but this looks okay. So what I'm going to do is hit instances running. And it tells me you are not authorized to perform this operation. So we didn't get the red, but it's saying I'm not authorized to perform something called EC2 describe instances. That's what I was trying to do. I was trying to get it to describe it by listing it on here. The description would include any details about the instance. That's not allowed, right? So I am prevented from viewing that. Now, I'm going to sign as user 2, right? So let's take a look at how we do that. At the top, I'm going to sign out, okay? So we're going to go over here and we'll use the sign out link. And I've signed out. Now I'm still in an incognito window, right? So now I can sign in using user 2, but I need that sign in link, which is still available over here. So let's go ahead and copy that. And I'll just paste it in here. And I get the unique sign in page. And now I can put in the user 2 credentials. Note it has a slightly different password. By the way, these are not very secure passwords, and typically you would set up a policy to prevent the use of something so simple. You'd want something a bit more complex. But for purposes of this lab, it's not a problem. And these users have very, very small amount of capabilities. So we can see here for this one, we've logged on. We're seeing, notice a little bit of access denied. It's not relevant to what we're trying to do. And what we want to do is go back over to EC2. So we can see a link here. So I'll go ahead and use that. Now for user 2, if you recall, and I'm going to scroll all the way back up, user 2 should be able to access EC2 support. And so what I'm going to do is go back over to the EC2 console. Go to the dashboard. And it doesn't look like I have any running instances. Okay. Click on that. And not because there is a permission issue, but probably because of this, the region I'm in. Now, if you recall, many, many resources are regional, meaning that when you launch that resource, it launches it into a specified region. EC2 is one of those, because when you launch an EC2 instance, a virtual machine, it launches it in a data center, and it doesn't launch copies of it, not by default. So you have a singular virtual machine, and it's running in a data center in a particular availability zone in a particular region, right? I'm in the wrong region. So I need to get Northern Virginia. So what I'm going to do is select that. And that will keep me within the EC2 console, but you can see now I can see 2 virtual machines here. And that's what I should have seen. So I'm in the appropriate region, using the appropriate user account, clicking on lab host. Now this user has the, if we scroll back up, EC2 support capability read-only access. So that's essentially being able to describe the instances, to be able to see the instances. Does it provide the ability to do anything else with it? Well, that's what we're going to find out. So I'm going to scroll back down to where we were, which is a bit further down here. Here we go. And what we're going to do is we're going to see if we can stop the instance. Okay. So I'll go to my instance state and tell it to stop it. And then it gives me a little warning. Okay. Not going to worry about that right now. I just want to see it will stop. This is one of those permission messages that tell me I'm not authorized. They do it in red so you can see it. There's a lot in here, but you can't read most of it because it's encrypted. The piece that's relevant is telling me that this particular user, user 2, is not authorized to perform a stop instances action on EC2 on a specific resource. The resource, I forgot the name of it, I think it was lab host. And it doesn't say lab host, it gives us the Amazon resource number because there's no policy that allows the stop instance action. This did exactly what it was supposed to do. Try to perform an action that's not allowable based upon the permissions of that group. So let's go to S3 now. Let's see what we can do with S3. At this point, do you think we can do anything with S3? Or are you thinking, oh, okay, you know what? The permissions aren't allowing that. We're going to find that out right now. So we'll just do a quick search over to or quick move over to S3 console. And you'll see that I can't see any buckets here because I don't have permissions to list the buckets. So if there's a bucket there, I can't see it. I don't have the permissions. S3 is global, which means that it's going to show me any bucket in any region. So there's no other regions to select. They're all grayed out because from one console, I can see all buckets for the account across the world. So it has nothing to do with the region, it has everything to do with this user's ability to sign in and out. Now, at this point, you've seen how to do this. So when we come back, we'll be signed in and we're going to take a look at this last piece and determining if this user will have the ability to stop the instance. So I'll see you on the next part of the video. Okay, so here you can see that we've logged in or signed in as user 3 in the private browsing window. So we signed out at 2, we're in user 3 using appropriate credentials. I'm on the EC2 console. I'm going to see if I can stop lab host. So I hit the wrong button. What I want to do is go over here and do the stop instance under instance state. Gives me a heads up about what stopping an instance means. We'll learn more about that next week. Successfully stopped. I should see the state of the instance has stopped eventually, but that shows me that my user has been appropriately privileged, meaning that that user by user 3 having been added to the appropriate group. In this case, the group is the EC2 admin with the ability to start and stop, have that capability. And we can see that there. And there you can see it's now stopped. And if I wanted to come in here and start it, I could. I don't want to do that because I want to make sure that it grades appropriately. And that's what the user was supposed to do anyways, was put it in a stopped state. While I'm at it, I just want to double check that that user does not have the ability to access S3 because even though they're an admin, it's for EC2. So if I take a look at S3, you can see they do not have access to buckets. So permissions generally don't block the ability to access the consoles. What it does is it prevents the consoles from querying the resources that reside under that service, and therefore blocks the ability to interact with those resources or create new resources, et cetera, depending upon the permissions that are applied. So users can still sign in, but they might not be able to do much of anything. All right, so that's essentially it for this lab. At this point, what I want to do is make sure I hit the submit button so that it gets graded. And I'm going to roll this out this way a little bit, and then I'll wait till it grades and then we'll come back. And here you can see that we have full points. We've accomplished all the necessary tasks. We ended with a stopped instance as expected. It can see that we've logged in under the different accounts, right? And we can see it can see the attempts that were made. All of that is using AWS CloudTrail, which is covered in the course and covered in detail in the next course as well. And then if we look at the grades, we can see that we have achieved full points in the grade book. That's it for this lab. Thanks for checking it out and enjoy.